Hi, welcome class. This week we are focusing on the relationship between memory, the performances of self, and surveillance, which I think are three terms that interlink as we're thinking about practices of documentation. And this is building off of last week's discussion of the difference between analog and digital. That ultimately one thing that makes digital media unique is that the very code that it's built around, its very character and nature encourages sharing. And as we share, we are also engaging in performances of identity as we distribute these documents of ourselves. And an ultimate result of that mode of sharing is that ultimately we're watching each other. We're spending a great deal of time engaging in participatory surveillance. In other words, we are engaging in practices where we are watching each other throughout the day. And this has become a normal sort of default mode of social media. So today what I want to focus on is medium-specific analysis to tap into the very core nature of digital media and to understand that ultimately when we're thinking about an analysis of documentation in the digital age, we have to understand each medium uniquely, that it exists in a very unique way in terms of its abilities, the way that it's used, and the way that it fits into these ecologies of media of documentation. So ultimately, throughout the class, we've talked about the history of documentation. We've talked about the movement of various modes of documentation, even from photography in the analog sense to the digital sense. And so we have this long genealogy of documentation that we're engaging. But now I want to drill down and really focus on the specifics of something like Instagram, which many of you are using in this class to take selfies throughout the week. So what about Instagram makes it appealing? Specifically, what does Instagram do that other platforms don't do? And part of the answer to that must be that we have to engage in a medium-specific analysis to look at the medium to say what are its affordances and constraints, what does it do well, what can't it do, and how are people engaging those affordances and constraints to then ultimately make something like Instagram a success. So this goes back to Marshall McLuhan's adage that the medium is the message. And he was describing this in his writings in the 1960s when he was essentially saying that the medium through which a message is conveyed will always affect the content. So we typically think of content as this free-floating mode of signifying, of telling a story, or of documenting something, that the content itself is often independent of the medium through which it's captured. So this week you're going to, as your assignment for Friday, engage in a medium-specific analysis, and you're going to document something in two different ways. And we tend to think of the thing that's documented as being independent of the modes of documentation. And what Marshall McLuhan is saying is that ultimately our understanding of the very things you're documenting depends on the media through which they're documented, that the media will always affect the ways that you understand the content. So one of the things that Catherine Hales is writing about in her article that you read from Monday is that materiality matters for how we are engaging with content. That the material nature of the ways that you're engaging the content, whether it be on a laptop, an iPad, an iPhone, a print book, all of those different media are going to affect the content. So for her, the material specifications of what makes a print book different from a laptop or an iPad are profoundly significant, even if the very words are identical. So if the words you're reading on your iPad are the exact same that you're reading in a print book, regardless, those two modes of content will change the ways that you interpret what the words mean. So this leads to something that I argue a lot, which is content is not seamlessly transferable across media. You can take the same exact content, but when you put it on different media, it changes what the content means because the material specifications, the material, physical, tangible realities of those technologies from book to iPad are going to always affect how you interpret content. So it's not transferable across media. So often in English and literary studies we talk about the difference between form and content. So content is the meaning of a poem, but how the poem is written, the layout of it, where you decide to break lines, how you decide to visualize the poem, where you decide to publish it, for example. All of those things are going to affect the meaning of it. So within literary studies, we always talk about form and content being interrelated. But for Marshall McLuhan, by saying the medium is the message, he's saying the form is the content. The form is actually a part of the meaning. Not just the words, not just the message, not just the relationships on a television show that you're watching. Ultimately, the form, the fact that it's on TV, is always going to impact the message itself. The television is actually a part of the message. The iPad is actually a part of the story. And so you cannot separate form and content. And that's ultimately what Catherine Hales is arguing in her article about a media-specific analysis, that what a medium does well and doesn't do well, its affordances and its constraints, are going to always determine how content gets engaged. And one of the things to keep in mind, it always ultimately exists within, something like Instagram exists within a larger network of relationships, so what many people call a media ecology. So we want to tap into the specifics of why people are using Instagram, but you also need to understand that Instagram has a relationship with Facebook. That Instagram is not its own island, that it's a part of these larger ideas of social media and practices of sharing. It exists within a culture that wants to share photographs and imagines visual documentation as a mode of social engagement, which is what Nathan Jurgensen talked about in his interview quite extensively, that the document is actually a mode of communication. And this taps right into the actor network maps that you guys created. Ultimately, those are about figuring out that Instagram does something unique as opposed to Twitter. It's not the same thing as Flickr or other photo sharing sites. It's unique. It does certain things well, but it does those well within a larger network. And I think one of the goals for the assignment this week is to say, what does Instagram do well? What do videos convey that a photograph doesn't? What does an Instagram photo convey that a different type of photograph might not? And these are the goals of the assignment, to say that these media are doing things very uniquely, and they're doing them within this larger network of technologies, social norms and expectations, and corporate concerns. All of those things create sort of this network of meaning within which something like Instagram exists. And connecting this to the Atlantic article that you read, where identity is a performance, one of the things that I find to be interesting from this piece is to understand that documentation in our era, and actually broadly speaking, is not even necessarily about the creation of a document. Sometimes objects become those documents of memory. That you can have a token that somebody gave you, and this is your document. This is your connection to a memory. That a photograph or a video is one mode of documentation, but actually having a souvenir or an heirloom or a material, tangible object in your life that reminds you of somebody. It's interesting then to move away from our practices of documentation to thinking about the objects in our lives as documentary, that they carry the same kinds of weight that perhaps a photograph might. One of the things that I found profound in her article in The Atlantic is that she discusses a photograph, that there is a photograph on a desk, and that photograph can be facing out or can be facing in, and that actually communicates differently to people. One of them is a performance, or a communication to an audience that comes into an office and sits there. It says, these are the people in my life. And one of them could be turning in towards the person who owns the desk to say, this is my space, and I am now connecting it to external things that I find meaningful in my life. And those documentary objects in our lives, those talismans, those heirlooms, function perhaps simultaneously to be performances of the self, to communicate identity to people, and also reminders of those links in your life, those relational links that you have with people in the world and with communities out in the world, as a mode of reminding yourself of a place that you belong. And I like to think of documents broadly in that sense. I think it's really useful to imagine documentary practices as extending to these objects in our lives, that objects can be documents, that a set of memories can be connected to the physical objects in our lives. So as you engage in your medium-specific analysis this week, one of the things that we're going to be looking at in the next lecture is to think about the act of participatory surveillance that many of these media encourage and are actually reliant on. One of the things that they do well is get us to share and to get us to watch each other. And so I want to talk about some of the implications of that in the next lecture. Have a good day.